The Index Center is institutionally linked to the Otto Suhr Institute at the Freie Universität Berlin. That is the politics department. And while we all have a background in politics, we understand ourselves as an interdisciplinary research center. That is, we draw on research and research methods from other disciplines, such as sociology, IR, law, and the humanities. And at the moment, the research we do is organized around 3 research groups. Janis Grimm leads a research project on discursive conditions of radical politics. Our colleague Mariam Salehi and her team researched the interplay between technocratized and emancipatory struggles for justice at a transnational level. And the research group led by me focuses on the ways in which our perceptions of violence and responsibility in relation to transnational corporations are shaped by international law. And if you would like to find out more about our research, you can check our website. And I guess even though we all work on different issues when it comes to the regions we focus on or the particular politics we're interested in, what connects our research is that we are interested in basic conceptual work on issues of peace and conflict studies and try to combine these with empirical process-oriented research. And that means that we both reflect on the discursive formations that shape our knowledge produced on peace and conflict, and also seek to provide empirically sound analysis of contemporary conflicts, which we consider necessary for informed political decision-making. And while none of us works explicitly on feminist perspectives in peace and conflict studies, we all draw on feminist approaches for our own research. And this is why we're excited that this panel can take place today and that we can all engage in discussions later. And one of the reasons that we choose to focus on feminist lens in today's knowledge production about peace and war is that against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we had the impression that while there have been so many important feminist contributions from peace and conflict studies and international relations over the past years, when it comes to mainstream media reporting and policy debates and policy decision-making, these are conspicuous by their absence. And this was until last week, so to say. We did certainly not expect that a central topic or central concept of feminist research, that of masculinity and war, would enter European mainstream media just before our event. That is thanks to Boris Johnson and his comment on Putin. And for those who have not followed the debate, let me just quote Johnson's comment, which he made in an interview with the ZDF in the context of the G7 summit last weekend. Boris, for those of you who have not heard it, said, "If Putin was a woman, which he obviously isn't, but if he were, I really don't think he would have embarked on a crazy macho war of invasion and violence in the way that he has. If you want a perfect example of toxic masculinity, it's what he, that is Putin, is doing in Ukraine." And there are many, many things to be said about this comment, as well on the irony that it was Boris Johnson who made it. However, I would, for today's session, just like to share one thought about it and the way it has been reported on in most media outlets. By some, the comment has been read as proof that feminist debates on war have reached top-level decision makers. However, if this is the case, what Johnson's comment makes even more evident is the challenge of communicating complex insights in a way they do not get watered down just to justify a particular political interest or simply reinforce gendered imaginaries and stereotypes. And the discussion today, we want to focus on both aspects, that is, on the importance of feminist methods and ethics in conflict research, and the question of what conflict aspects it can highlight, especially those aspects that are usually overlooked by more traditionalist research and reporting on war and violence, and also about masculinity and its role in conflict. And second, the challenges of amplifying feminist or critical approaches in the broader disciplinary discussions, which are often dominated by realist war and security studies, and related hereto and related to Bauer's comment, the relationship between knowledge production about gender and sexuality and policy making. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your inputs and thoughts on these challenges, and hand over to Mariam now, who will introduce the speakers and lead us through the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. I am very happy to welcome our panelists today. And I mean, Sabina has already said a few words about whom we are welcoming here today, but I want to say a few more words and also yeah, talk a bit about your different research topics. So we have Lina Cespedes-Baez, who is a professor at Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá, and her research focuses on legal feminism and feminist legal theory, on wastelands, land restitution and theory of property, as well as on sexual violence. And Lina has published on these issues with regard to the Colombian conflict mainly. Then we have Millie Lake, who is an associate professor in international security at the London School of Economics. She works on institution building, political violence, and insecurity in conflict-affected contexts. And lots of Millie's research and writing focuses on cases on the African continent, in particular the Democratic Republic of Congo. And last but not least, we have Louise Turner, who is a lecturer in international politics at Newcastle University. Louise is a political ethnographer at the intersection of feminist international politics, refugee and humanitarian studies. Geographically, he focuses on the Middle East, which he puts in quotation marks, and has in particular published on Syrian refugees in Jordan. And before we start our discussion, yeah, just a quick note on procedures. We have prepared some questions, as Sabina has already said. And afterwards, we will have time for questions from the audience. And if you have questions, you can either post them in the chat, or you can yeah, ask them later personally during the Q&A. We asked our panelists to prepare a short input statement to kick off our discussion today, addressing the question, what constitutes a feminist perspective on conflict, war, and its aftermath, and in which ways does it matter in your own research? Lina, do you want to start?
Hi, Mariam, and hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited about this conversation. I'm sure we're going to get very interesting questions and very interesting inputs. Just to start, I have to say that this question is a very relevant question because sometimes you forget to ask it. I guess sometimes you ask it at the beginning of your research or when you start doing research about armed conflict, but then you just forget it and you have the autopilot and just start doing research and just writing, etc. So I guess it's very important just to have it in mind all the time. I was tempted to just print it out and put it on top of my computer. Like I have to remember this every time I approach this subject. So I guess I'm going to give a short and very straightforward answer to this question just to start a conversation. And I'm going to say that I approach conflict, war, and its aftermath from a feminist perspective, asking what I dub as the woman question. And when I'm saying this, I'm just paraphrasing a very a very famous feminist legal scholar, Catherine Bartlett. She wrote an article in the 1990s. Her article is called Feminist Legal Methods. And in this seminar article, she explores how lawyers are trained to think about legal issues and why this way of thinking legal issues obscures how law creates and replicates discrimination and violence against women. Basically, what Bartlett is saying in that article is that lawyers are trained to select facts and match them with rules, but not necessarily they are trained to explore the bias of specific norms and rationales and methods and provisions regarding the discrimination against women. So when we ask lawyers to ask the woman question, we ask them to complement their traditional method of legal reasoning with an inquiry about the power of the law. Hence, this analysis paves the way for determining how certain assumptions, negative or positive, about women are embedded in the legal system and are replicated generally without us, lawyers, women, men, citizens, noticing how we replicate this bias. So basically, that has been my starting point in all my legal research. And in relation to conflict, what I do is that I translate this question, basically first telling myself and people that are working with me, when you ask a question, you really have to ask a question. That means you use the question to uncover bias, and also you are open to the answer. You don't have a predetermined answer, but you have like some premises. You have some premises to approach this question, and I have 4 premises to approach my work in relation to war, to peace building from a feminist perspective. First, that women as a group have been historically discriminated against. Thus, it is mandatory to ask the woman question if you want to completely understand all the dimensions of conflict and peace building. That's my first premise. The second one is that the particular instantiations of violence and discrimination against women vary depending on other features, such as ethnicity, class, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. Basically, I'm talking about intersectionality, and we can talk more about that, how difficult it is to really include an intersectional analysis sometimes, but that's the first premise, because what I'm saying, it is not enough to ask the woman question if you don't fully characterize women and understand how those other features play in intensifying their experience of discrimination in the context of war or in the context of peace building. Third, my third premise, not every manifestation of war or peace building impacts women disproportionately vis-a-vis men. Thus, claiming disproportion should not be a given in your research. That's something that you can reach or you can end up proving, but it's not a must. So you should not turn into an empty word or mandatory finding the disproportion to legitimize your feminist research. You can underscore disparate impacts, but in order to prove disproportion, basically your parameter is really high, and you have to reach it in order to claim disproportion. And fourth, structural accounts of discrimination and violence against women based on sexual domination of men over women could be helpful to determine strategies of feminist engagements with the study of conflict and its aftermath. However, they could not galvanize a unidimensional depiction of women in war as mainly victims that could not grasp the full extent of their experience in this context. So I'll leave it there just to start the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lina. That was already very thought-provoking, I would say. Millie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you to all of you, Lina, for those really thoughtful comments, and to Hannah also for the really kind introductory remarks that I think provide a really wonderful basis for kicking off this conversation. So yeah, I'm super grateful for the opportunity or the kind of curation of this space to have this discussion. As Lena, you mentioned, it's a conversation we should be having more frequently than we are often having it in practice. And so it's really nice to just have the opportunity to reflect on that, because I feel like in some ways a lot stays constant, but a lot changes in terms of what it means, for me at least in my own work, to bring a feminist perspective to the study of war and its aftermath. So I maybe will just say a couple of things about how I came, or like what that journey has looked like for me, I suppose. So I came to the study of political violence through a fairly circuitous route, and could go back a long way to before I like before my professional life, but certainly before academia. I worked for a human rights organization that focused on legal capacity building, and I was much more kind of focused on legal responses to violence in contexts of war, fragility, and transition, and especially concerned with these questions of how to build strong and robust and durable legal systems that are kind of capable of resolving violence peacefully. But through this project, and then the kind of early stages of my dissertation research, which from these themes, I ended up coming to think a lot about how knowledge is produced. And I think this is kind of dovetails really nicely, or bleeds really nicely into what we're going to talk about today. And especially I became very preoccupied with this question of how research is practiced, what it means to study war from the kind of outside, and we can deconstruct what that term means as well. But most importantly, how institutions like the study, kind of similar to the study of war and violence themselves, are only ever as strong as the people who kind of prop them up, who believe in them, who participate in them, who work in them, who use them. And so by this, I'm really referring to this idea, I think, of studying war and the state from below, that I drew initially from my supervisor, Joel Migdal, but also from decades of feminist scholarship and also community politics in my kind of non-academic life, that encourages us to center the margins, as Lena has been describing, to look at what falls outside structures of power and dominance in order to understand how power operates. And so for me, a feminist perspective on conflict, war, and its aftermath is comprised both of what we study, so the things that we study and where we focus our gaze, but also how we study them and how we kind of practice that. So regarding what we study, I guess I'm concerned with studying violence not only through what we can see in front of us, but also what we don't see and what we're kind of trained not to see, or socialized not to see, both kind of personally, individually, but also systemically. And so I learned through, I guess, the earliest phases of my research that definitions of war and violence, as they're often constructed in academic scholarship, can prevent us from seeing the really complex, multifaceted, contradictory ways that people live and experience violence in their everyday lives, and also kind of end up imposing definitions that are constructed externally that aren't always faithful to the realities of the phenomena we think we are studying. So how can we understand war and violence in ways that aren't bound up and determined by the same structures of power that produce that violence in the first place? So in my recent work, a recent article I just completed on policing and security sector reform in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've done a lot of my research, I show how differently war is described by those living within its midst from how we as political scientists might define it or understand it. And so to give an example, I always ask my interviewees, who were predominantly comprised of ordinary people living in and affected by Congo's most recent sequence of wars, to describe what the war was, who were its kind of proponents, and what it meant in their daily lives. And nearly everyone I spoke to kind of described a war of the everyday, a war of hunger, of poverty, of harassment, of intimidation. When asked who the drivers of the war were, most people talked first about police and other agents of the state that they encountered in everyday bureaucracies of checkpoints and markets, etc. So we can see how these kind of fluidities of what war is and is not really kind of bleed into each other. And so, drawing on a strong feminist tradition in my work, I reflect on how and why we understand certain phenomenon, for example, catastrophic events such as battlefield clashes or shelling, to be kind of more worthy of study, while others routinized bureaucratic violence inflicted by state or the insipid, slow violence of climate change and pollution is kind of often responsible for much more harm, to be peripheral to the study of war when it's these kind of forms of violence are produced by the same systems of oppression. So when I think about studying war through a feminist lens, to me, this means asking, like, what are the hierarchies, power relationships, and interdependencies that permit all forms of violence and war to thrive? How can we look beyond these static binaries of war and peace, of state and non-state, of conflict onset and termination, to think about complexity, contradiction, continuity? How can we understand the ways that violence is created through its embeddedness in states, in markets, in nations and families, and through other interlocking systems of power? And how can we avoid ascribing value and importance to certain phenomena, to certain subjects of violence, to certain sites, as Lina has been describing, in ways that kind of transcend these very state-centric hierarchies, colonial hierarchies, patriarchal hierarchies that privilege certain forms of expertise, that privilege certain forms of knowledge, that are bound up with these structures responsible for producing violence in the first place, and paint some forms of knowledge derived from people in positions of power as legitimate or meaningful, while other knowledge derived from the margins is kind of constructed as illegitimate. And so this leads us on to thinking about how we study, not just what we see, but also how we practice research, how we kind of engage in research. And my feminist approach to studying war and violence seeks to also try and disrupt these hierarchies and systems of knowledge production, to unlearn the ways that we are kind of trained to study and see and think more creatively about how we know what we know, how what we know might look different if we kind of recenter or refocus. So I think in the last few years, I've been thinking much more deliberately and intentionally about how we do this, how we might embody and implement some of this politics as we do research through institutions that have historically been bound up with the kind of replication and reinforcing of these systems of power that are responsible for violence, and thinking about these questions through work with the Advancing Research on Conflict program, with the Women's Rights After War project, and really especially with my collaborator Marie Berry, who has obviously like helped inform and build some of these insights. So I think I can turn to that in the next round of questions, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Millie. And I'm already excited about asking the next question in the next round. But before that, Luis, do you want to give us your input statement? We can't hear you yet. Maybe you're still muted.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay. Seems like there's two ways I have to unmute. Okay. So thank you, Mariam. Thank you all for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Lina and Millie, for these really interesting statements. And Hannah, thank you for starting us off on the day that Boris Johnson resigns with his, shall we say, quote unquote, insights into international politics. I think for anyone who's following UK politics today, from someone who lives and is based there, I would just like to say that I hope you're enjoying this as much as we are. So, so what constitutes a feminist perspective on war and its aftermath, and in what ways does it matter in your own research? And I found this a really thought-provoking question, actually, and it took me quite some time to sort of try and even start to put an answer into place, which I think speaks to the kind of richness of the question, and I think that richness was really evident in Lina and Millie's answers. So my work focuses much more on the sort of aftermath side than the war and conflict side, as it were. So I'll be speaking a bit more to that, and to kind of interventions and humanitarian interventions in the aftermath or as a consequence of conflict. And like Millie, I thought I would perhaps say a few words about how I got to studying and researching what I research, and also how that kind of relates to what I understand to be a feminist perspective on these issues. And I came to what I now do through a kind of background in Middle East gender studies, and in particular being interested in Middle East masculinity studies. And sort of when I was doing my PhD, sort of came at that topic trying to think about, or wanting to think about, how masculinities changed in the aftermath of conflict, thinking about Syrians living outside of Syria. And in a sense, that's been something of a focus that I've had, but I have become, and quite quickly became, much more interested in humanitarian responses and gendered humanitarian responses to the aftermath of conflict. And in particular, as I'll maybe talk about more a bit later, part of the reason, or a large part of the reason for that interest and something of a shift in focus, was that I was unbelievably fascinated by the ways that humanitarians, in their policies, but even more in their daily language, talked about gender, and in particular talked or didn't talk about men. And that's kind of been the crux, I suppose, or the hook that got me interested in these topics. And I think it was also listening to and thinking about how humanitarians, so how those who are either sent or are not sent, but are already from the same context, but so either are sent or stand up to respond to conflict. So I think it's thinking about how they think about gender is where I try to kind of deploy a feminist perspective on war and its aftermath. And I think for me that feminist perspective, which links both to aspects of Lena's answer and Millie's answer, is about an attentiveness to power, and an attentiveness to hierarchy, to exclusion, to marginalization, and an attentiveness to those things in all of their forms, which is, of course, why one of the many reasons why intersectionality is so central, or should be so central, those feminist perspectives. And part of what was interesting for me, and has remained interesting for me as a researcher of those topics, is how I found myself perhaps stuck between, or sometimes felt trapped between, that kind of feminist perspective, or attempting to deploy that kind of feminist perspective as a researcher, and the kinds of feminism or the kinds of feminist perspectives that were and remain very dominant in humanitarian settings and in humanitarian work. And so I found that the feminist perspective I was trying to bring perhaps wasn't always appreciated by those who have the sort of official stamp of authority to speak as feminists in those contexts. And this is the feminism of quote unquote women's empowerment, which, or we should say perhaps particular understandings of women's empowerment, the particular kinds of programmatic, culturally essentialist, often responses to questions of work and work empowerment, labor market participation, psychosocial support, sexual and gender-based violence. And while all of these topics are central and crucially important, the programmatic responses to them I often have found to be very troubling. And so I think then, in one sense, my answer to this question is about an intersectional attentiveness to power and hierarchy. And I guess I also wanted to highlight, as in terms of thinking about how that's factored into my research, not only that that's a perspective I try to bring through my work, but also some of the challenges that I found in trying to navigate different feminisms while actually doing that research, and also while speaking publicly and writing about those topics. So I'll leave it for there now, but thanks again. I'm really delighted to be here with you all today.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. And that already perfectly brings us to the next question, which I would ask to Millie. Millie, you've already mentioned the Women's Rights After War project. And one of your stated aims for the project is that you would like to re-theorize women's empowerment. Can you tell us a bit about your findings and how these contrast with conventional understandings of how interventions for gender equality unfold in post-war societies?
Thanks, Mariam. That's a really great question, and I wish I could I wish I could answer it more eloquently than I think I'm going to. But I think I want to say two kind of main things. How long do you want us to talk for in these second responses? Quicker or still like 5 minutes or whatever?
We have enough time, I would say. So
I'll try.
take your time.
I'll try and be quick, and maybe I'll just cut myself off if I end up rambling too much. Because I think I want to say like two separate things, and our aim is to kind of re-theorize women's empowerment, and the reasons why I think we don't have a like good or I don't have a great answer to your question right now is tied up with the first thing I want to say, which is that like I spoke about these two projects, the Women's Rights After War project and the Advancing Research on Conflict project. And my kind of impetus for both of these projects, although they're very different in nature, the one is a kind of field work preparation, like training for doctoral students and like a archive or a resource for doing ethical research in context of conflict, and the other is a more kind of explicitly academic empirical research project. But the impetus for both of these were to kind of think about the ways in which certainly in my doctoral training, and I don't want to speak for too many other people, but I think this is very common in US political science programs, and probably which is where I was trained, but probably also kind of travels to different institutions elsewhere as well, is that we didn't receive very much in the way of practical training on what doing research meant and looked like. The result of that, I think, in the course of my field work was seeing a lot of very unethical practices and ways of kind of generating knowledge that were really rooted in these quite proprietary traditions of gathering data in extractive ways and publishing research findings in a kind of competitive and career progressing way that wasn't necessarily faithful to the way that research is in practice kind of produced, but also it really fosters some of the most I guess the most extractive that kind of incentive or impetus to publish and to publish well and to publish solo authored work also kind of incentivizes the most extractive damaging form of research. And especially for this became really salient for me, thinking about my own role and positionality as a researcher from the global north, working in Central Africa. And so, yeah, I mean, kind of as I said in the opening remarks, I think this led me to really think about like a lot about how we know what we know and what kinds of knowledge producing traditions create the corpus of knowledge that we have in international relations and political science about what war is and how it functions, and to think about how we might do things differently. And the Women's Rights After War project really picked up that question, to think about how and this speaks a little bit to what Lewis was just talking about, but like how do we think about what women's empowerment after war looks like? What knowledge is that based on? Like what academic kind of scholarly knowledge is our understanding of that question based on? And what does it do? You know, what are empowerment efforts actually doing in practice? As I mentioned in the first set of remarks, we really see this focus for privileging and the kind of centering of spectacular violence. And we have a lot of our key research findings derived from forms of research that aren't centering empathy and vulnerability and humanity and power, but rather kind of based on either, you know, interviews or surveys or practices that are a little distanced and more more extractive in nature. And so we wanted to understand, one of the goals of the project was to understand the impacts of status quo kind of empowerment efforts in the aftermath of war. We have this research finding that, you know, in the aftermath of war, we see like upticks in women's rights and participation in politics, in the economy, etc., that derive from both social and demographic and economic shifts, but also from advocacy by women's organizations, by feminist groups, and by advocacy movements, and by international organizations and donors. We don't know a lot about what those efforts are, actually mean in practice in women's everyday lives, and also who they serve. And one of the things that, I guess one of the main things that we've kind of confirmed in our research in the Women's Rights After War project, that is currently, we were very disrupted by COVID. So that's just one kind of major caveat, but we have also been disrupted in other ways, I think, intellectually and much more productive ways. But the project focuses on 6 countries at the moment: Sri Lanka, Colombia, Iraq, Bosnia, Rwanda. I feel like I missed one and I'm not sure what I've said already. But anyway, Nepal. So we have been thinking about these kind of key domains of the women, peace and security agenda: women's participation in peace negotiations, in economic empowerment, family law reform, criminal law reform, transitional justice, and women's political participation. And what we kind of learn is that effectively, oftentimes, and not always, but oftentimes, the effects of women empowerment programs after war and the gains that women make after war are really disproportionately distributed along kind of either conflict cleavages or cleavages that find their roots in colonial kind of distributive politics that reinforce both social, economic, and political structures of power that were responsible for producing violence in the first place. So we see inequalities kind of fermented and shorn up through the accessibility that some women have, women from privileged or dominant identity backgrounds, to access power, and that are kind of structurally impossible for. So just by way of example, we've just been finishing up writing a piece at the moment. We're looking at the ways in which Tamil and Muslim women in Sri Lanka are structurally and kind of systematically disenfranchised from being able to take advantage of really any women's empowerment efforts due to the disproportionate securitization and harassment, intimidation, and marginalization that they face at the hands of the security services every day. So what are the realities that women from marginalized backgrounds are facing in their everyday lives that impede their equitable access to empowerment initiatives? I feel like I've been speaking forever, so I will stop there. But I guess one of the ideas of re-theorizing women's empowerment would be to really think about what power looks like, feels like, means, and how it's practiced for women from a diverse array of different backgrounds, and not only women, but other marginalized identities in post-war or post-peace agreement contexts, when it certainly, the disruption of power doesn't, as we observe, come about through legislative change. And that's not to say legislative change isn't useful and necessary and central, but it doesn't mean, as we all know, shifts in power arrangements in society, in the public sphere, and in the kind of private sphere, in the household, in daily life. So I think, so that was a little rambling and I spoke forever, but I will, hopefully some of that was intelligible, and I will stop there.
I think that was definitely very rich, and we will go back to questions of like rights and legal perspectives later with Lina. But first, I want to ask Luis. I mean, Luis, you often focus in your research on men and how they are neglected in humanitarianism, what you already said. And I would ask you, what can we learn about conflict and humanitarianism by focusing on men and masculinities that we would maybe miss otherwise?
Thanks very much. Is my voice okay this time? Great. Okay. So neglect is a tricky word. And maybe maybe there's some senses in which that's true. I think there definitely are some senses in which that's true, and I still somehow hesitate to say it because I feel like one accidentally, or I accidentally wade into a whole series of very heated debates that are kind of happening within humanitarianism, and has regularly led me to I think being perhaps misunderstood. But maybe I'll park that thought for now at least. But certainly I think the focus on men in humanitarianism and the ways in which humanitarians are interested in talking about, working with, working on, engaging with men or not, and often it is a not. Yeah, I think tells us quite a lot, or can tell us quite a lot about a range of different aspects of war and conflict and its aftermath. So I think part of that, about which there's, I think, much research to be done across contexts, or much to be learned, is simply about men's experiences of conflict, but also the aftermath of conflict, perhaps especially their experiences of these things beyond their participation in militaries, which has obviously been, one central focus of a lot of feminist scholarship, rightly has been. So I think there's that firstly. But I think one of the things that I have felt through doing the research that I do is that understanding the ways that men are included or not in different aspects of humanitarian structures tells us about men's experiences, yes, which is important, but I think it also tells us a lot, or can tell us a lot, about humanitarian structures. And I think a lot of the things that I've been most interested in exploring are what understanding, or what can we learn about humanitarian structures by focusing on men and masculinities. And so in other previous work that I've published, I've talked about the different ways that, or the different positions that men have within humanitarianism. So whether that's kind of racialized tropes about them as sources of insecurity, or as sort of particularly patriarchal and therefore obstacles to progress, or obstacles to particular visions of women's empowerment. How often men simply generate disinterest from humanitarians. And one of the things that I found most interesting about, and still find most interesting about doing this research, is how often humanitarians in particular were sort of surprised and sometimes confused that I was even asking these questions. Often they were very interested, and sometimes they were very interested for a whole set of other problematic and anti-feminist reasons about, from people who wanted to push back against what they saw as sort of too much focus on women, which is a whole other sort of side of the complexity. But then at other times, men will be seen as kind of objects of potential reform within humanitarianism. And so I think turning this sort of, as I was talking about in the first answer, this kind of feminist lens of attentiveness to power onto humanitarian structures and policies and workers and daily practices, we can ask what that says about humanitarianism. And I think one of the things that's really fascinated me is to try and ask why humanitarians often seem so much more comfortable and ready to hold power over women and children than maybe they do over men. And I think they wouldn't say it as holding power or describe it in that way. They would probably see it as programmatic interventions. But in fact, what a lot of these programmatic interventions are, or entail, or result in, are an exercise of power, I think, over those groups of people. And so there's one answer that I think a lot of humanitarians would give about kind of a feminist sensibility and trying to prioritize women's needs and the diverse ways in which they're affected by conflict. And obviously that is both important and indeed sometimes what is driving it. But I think also it helps us then to get a new angle, or a different angle, on the often quite dominating, often quite colonial, often quite patronizing ways that humanitarianism can function. So I think, yeah, that focus on men and masculinities and the ways that men are included or not, if included is the right word, tells us about men and their experiences, tells us about gender more widely and the range of gendered experiences. But it also tells us a lot, or can tell us a lot, about humanitarians and not only what they think about men and masculinities, but also what they think about and how they relate to women and femininities and people of other genders too.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I chose the word neglect after having read one of these interview excerpts that you provided with your interview partner stating that they haven't thought about men, basically. And so I think this is why I picked that word. But yeah, it's probably, yeah, something to discuss whether it's the right word.
Yes, it's a politically complex word, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. Yeah.
Lina, your research has focused on revolutionary feminism and the strategic use of international law. And I would like to ask whether you can tell us a bit more on how these two things go together, especially with regard to the critique of rights language we've heard about before.
Thank you, Mariam. So one of the things that I'm interested in, and as I noted before, and in this, I think Lewis and Millie, we agree, is that I'm very interested in criticizing the dominant approaches to war, peace building, transitional justice, etc. And also the dominant feminist perspectives, because we have to be aware that not every feminist strand or every feminist line of thought is the one that is going to impact, for instance, international law. And international law has a really powerful effect on how we understand conflict and how we understand transition. And you can see it in Colombia. And as you said at the beginning, I'm specialized in the Colombian armed conflict, and you can see how changes in international law have impacted the way Colombia has dealt with the specific moments of its conflict. So being 2005, the Colombian government wanted to start to demobilize paramilitary groups. So basically they follow international law in what transitional justice at that time thought or mandated that it should be done during a transition. And then we have the peace process with the FARC guerrilla, and we have a more robust approach to transitional justice, an approach that takes in consideration more the rights of the victims, etc. So the thing is that international law is very, at least in Colombia, and I guess in global South countries, is very present, is very powerful. So one of the things that you have to ask yourself when you're doing this feminist research, and if you're approaching this feminist research as a lawyer or as somebody that is taking into account how international law shapes the way we understand the subjects or the individuals and the communities that are participating or are being impacted by war, you have to ask how international law has been receptive to feminism and what kind of feminism has been the one that has been embedded in international law. And so one of the things that I have studied in detail is how the Colombian armed conflict was gender, how gender was included in the Colombian armed conflict, and what kind of legal rationale and legal arguments were made in order to do that. And so what I found, and I say we because I'm not the only one that has done this kind of analysis, but what I have found is that in the 1990s, Colombia was going through a very specific part or a very specific period in which we were changing our constitution and we were starting to get into the trend of liberal, like neoliberal constitutionalism. When I say neoliberal, I'm not referring to specifically the economic model, but I'm talking about this model of doing constitutions by the end of the 1990s. And so we are getting into that trend of modifying constitutions. We are including a lot of fundamental rights in those constitutions. And also in that moment, something happened that it was very important, is that the feminist movement in Colombia, or the women's movement in Colombia, just that something changed for them. In the 1980s, the feminist movement was very suspicious of the law. But in the 1990s, after participating in some of these debates about the new constitution, feminists changed in Colombia, and they decided that they needed the law, and they can use strategically the law. So we have like a second wave of feminism in Colombia. I can dub it second wave, in the sense that the law and the lawyers, the feminist lawyers, became so central to the discussions about women's rights in Colombia. And that impacted the way they gender the conflict. And so the way they gender the conflict, how gender was introduced into the conflict, was using the international law rationale of disproportion. Basically, I'm talking about the CEDAW's committee's recommendation, specifically number 19, that's 1992. Disproportion, women were facing a disproportionate impact in the Colombian armed conflict. And little by little, gradually, the analysis, the feminist analysis of the conflict, centered on sexual violence. And I guess that was something that it was needed, but because, of course, sexual violence was understood by the time, not only in Colombia, but in the world in general, as a side effect. And so in the 1990s, in the international law, there is this really strong movement at the international level to make sexual violence into a serious crime in itself, not because the honor of men was basically tarnished, but because women were entitled, or women were entitled to human rights. Basically, women's rights are human rights. So what happened in Colombia is that in that way, the conflict was gender. And you can see, if you analyze the specific legal reasonings they use, the feminist movement, you can see that radical feminism, or what I call also a structural feminism, is really important to make these arguments. It's basically playing with the binary, strengthening the binary between men and women, strengthening a heterosexual way of understanding conflict. It's basically men, or the masculinity. There's a toxic masculinity that gets expressed in conflict, and the maximum expression of this masculinity is sexual violence. So one of my critiques is that in that way, it was very important to shed light on what was happening to women in that context, and that sexual violence was very important in a way that we had to make it visible. But at the same time, that obscured other crimes, other harms that women and other populations were experiencing. So, for instance, we lost the sight of what was happening to social and economic rights of these women. We were losing sight of men, what was happening to men. And it was difficult just to ask the question, for instance, if more men were dying in massacres, is that a gender crime? It's basically, you can talk in terms of gender about this type of crimes. So basically, what I have done so far is, like, in my, I don't know, I don't want to say how many years I have spent doing this, but in these many years, is just to understand how the conflict was gender, and how the way a conflict is gender impacts or shapes our responses to conflict, and puts forward or makes available to men and women certain scripts to fight for their rights. and how those scripts are sometimes really narrow, very, or that they underscore certain dimensions of the experience of conflict and obscures others. One of the things that I have coupled this research recently with another type of research that I'm doing about conflict, and is trying to understand the woman that participated in conflict actively. I'm talking about woman, demobilized women, demobilized women from the guerrillas. I'm interested in them for two reasons. First, because they challenge all the stereotypes about what is to be a woman in conflict, at least in Colombia. Second of all, because we had the opportunity during the peace process with the FARC to know them better. When we spent these 4 years negotiating with the FARC, these women were present at Havana, Cuba, negotiating, and now that they demobilized, they are part, not all of them, but some of them that are very visible, they are part of a political party in Colombia right now, a political party that was born out of the demobilization of the FARC. And one of the things that they decided to do as part of their transition to civilian life was to shape a new kind of feminism. Because when they went to Havana, they encountered these feminist ideas about conflict that basically don't really talk to them. These ideas don't talk to them because they were ideas about victimhood, about basically being a victim in conflict, being peaceful, not using arms, etc. And so this woman, when they encountered this kind of feminism, they decided that they needed a different type of feminism. So right now, what I'm doing research about is how this new feminist, they call it insurgent feminism, has taken shape, and how this feminism challenges and perhaps enriches the feminism that was shaped in the 19th and the early 2000s to respond to conflict and to gender conflict.
Thank you, Lina. Yeah, so much interesting research going on, and I think we're looking all forward to see what's coming out of there. We have one more round of questions before we open for questions from the audience. And yeah, now I would like to come to the relationship between knowledge production or academic knowledge production and policy making, and the question of what feminist perspectives can contribute here. Luis, you've worked on the Jordan Compact, respectively work policies and the labor market. What would you say, how is your research related to policy in that regard?
Yes, thank you. Another excellently sort of phrased and framed and thought-provoking and challenging to answer question. And so what can the feminist perspective contribute there? So for those who maybe don't know, very briefly, the Jordan Compact is a deal struck between the government of Jordan and its donors in early 2016, in which Jordan agreed to facilitate access to the formal labor market for Syrian refugees living in Jordan, in exchange for increased donor support and access to preferential access to World Bank loans and a series of preferentially improved preferential trade agreements with the European Union and so on and so forth. And in that deal, or rather because that deal was framed around work permits in large part, and because work permits became the benchmark against which funding would be distributed, there has been a very large focus on the numbers of work permits and how to increase them. And one perhaps point of discussion, controversy, not quite sure what the right word would be, since the early days of the Jordan Compact has been the very low proportion of the work permits issued that have gone to Syrian women. So for several years, that stood at around 5% of work permits issued to Syrians going to Syrian women. And that's in the latest figures I can remember seeing, I think that was now up to 8% for the for 2021. Although maybe it's still around 6-7% if you take the total number since 2016, which is of course extremely low. And it has been a point of discussion. It's been the subject of a wide range of different labour market interventions, but from humanitarian actors and NGOs to try and increase the proportion of work permits and the number of work permits that are issued to Syrian women. And I think perhaps this is an example through which we can see how some of the different feminist perspectives that we've been talking about get incorporated into policy, but also then some of the challenges of trying to bring alternative, if you like, feminist perspectives into those discussions and to try and translate that research into policy spheres and circles. So the reasons why the proportion of work permits that have gone to Syrian women is so low is difficult to answer. Well, in one sense, it's easy to answer. We know that there's a lot of reasons. In another sense, it's harder to answer because we know there are a lot of reasons. So it ranges from the kinds of work that's available within the economy. It relates to the informality of the labour market, and therefore a lot of Syrian women in surveys don't see the point of getting a work permit. But it also relates, of course, to a lot of patriarchal structures and the challenges that women can have when trying to seek paid work, paid participation in the labour force outside the home. And one of the challenges then, I think, is to think about how does one support the interventions that support women to do the work, the paid work that they might want to do outside of the home, without trying to push women who don't want to do that work into doing that work because they are, of course, as we all know, already working. And so one of the early focuses in this scheme was trying to get women in particular to work in garment factories, which is one of Jordan's largest export industries. And so the difficulties here, one of the primary difficulties was very fundamentally that the vast majority of Syrian women did not want to do this work. And that might have been because their factories were far away. There's cultural reasons, if you like, for want of a better term. There's a lack of childcare facilities, but also for a lot of people, the wages are very low and the conditions very poor. And so I think there's a really interesting challenge here of thinking, well, what are the different, feminist perspectives on this issue? And I think the dominant humanitarian feminist framing, if you like, has been that this is a problem and that, this work must be facilitated. Whereas one might think that a feminist perspective that's more intersectional and more attentive to a range of broader structures of power might say that actually there's something exceptionally feminist in Syrian women saying, we refuse to do this work, that is undignified and that is badly paid and isn't to our interests, doesn't suit our lives. And I think that perspective really hasn't, that feminist perspective really hasn't come through in humanitarian policies and discussions. And what's much rather happened is quite a simplistic equation between empowerment on the one hand and paid work in the formal labor market outside the home on the other hand. And so I think that feminists, so then there's multiple feminist perspectives, right? And I guess why I chose to talk about that example is that I think in response to your question of how does this relate to the kind of policy field, is that one of the challenges that I think feminist researchers have is trying to navigate also these competing and dominant feminist perspectives within the policy field. And in fact, one might say that a feminist perspective on the challenges of facilitating Syrian women's participation in the formal labor market, one might say that a feminist perspective on that is that actually, if there is no capacity to solve the structural issues that women face, then they shouldn't be pushed, if you like, to undertake work that they find undignified or inappropriate or whatever it is that they might be. And I think part of the problem then of those kind of feminist perspectives is that they run counter not just to the dominant feminist perspective within humanitarianism, but also to the broader structures that have decided that what Syrians need and what Jordan needs is more Syrians working in the formal labor market with work permits. So perhaps it would have been nicer or better if I had had a more of a success story of the translation of these kind of complex feminist research insights into policy. But I think that is certainly my experience of some of the challenges that I thought connected with some of the earlier things we were talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. And I think we will pick up on exactly this issue or a related issue later with Millie. But yeah, before that, I would hand over to Lina. And Lina, one concrete policy field you've been working on is land rights. And we would be interested in what your experience is with interaction with policymaking in this field. And I mean, you're a lawyer, you're also like dealing with yeah, policy making, lawmaking, and so we would be interested in that perspective.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I guess at least this is my case when I do this kind of research and I write and submit papers. In the end, what you want to accomplish is to accomplish some changes in what people that are not in academia say real life. They dub real life, the real sector, etc. I guess we are part of the real life. Sometimes I find troubling the division between academia, something that is not part of the real sector. And yes, I guess when I write, I want to impact specifically lawmaking, and I want to impact first. In the case of the Colombian armed conflict, I want to impact how the women's movement prioritizes strategies and actions in their agenda. Then if they can, because I don't feel that I'm the one that should be impacting specifically lawmaking. I guess these groups, NGOs, the women's movement, should be the ones impacting this kind of policymaking, lawmaking, because I guess in that way we can guarantee that they are not depoliticized. One of the things that really worries me sometimes about all the dynamics of NGOs funding, the ways that lawyers sometimes take over these topics, is that we depoliticize the movement. So I guess I want to impact first the movement. One of the, I don't know if this is a success story, but I guess it's part also about being really mindful about what is happening with a protracted armed conflict and a protracted implementation of peace processes. Because in Colombia, we don't have only one peace process. We have been doing peace processes. We have been completing peace processes since the 1980s, at least. And so we have different instances and different peace processes that have been somehow successful or not. For instance, right now, our president-elect, the one that was elected, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, he is a demobilized guerrilla member. And he was part of a peace process that was finished 30 years ago. So I guess that tells you a lot of things about peace processes and how long they take to be successful, or how they are sometimes successful in some parts and in others they are not. So I guess one of the things that has happened in Colombia is that the feminist movement and the women's movement have changed throughout these decades. And so this radical feminist movement in Colombia in the 1990s and the early 2000s has changed in the late, maybe in the 2010s, started to change because precisely of the peace process. And precisely because voices like mine and other voices from the academia started to say, you are focusing on something that you should focus on, sexual violence, that this is important, but you should also think about what is happening to women and land, what is happening to women and social economic rights, etc. So one of the things that I have seen that has changed and it has been translated into policy and into lawmaking is how the women's movement started to think seriously about women and land. Not as an instantiation of sexual violence, because at the beginning they were saying women were losing their land because they flee from sexual violence or the threat of sexual violence. And we started to say that could be true in some instances, but also women experience other kind of insecurity regarding land tenure that is not necessarily tied to sexual violence. It is tied to other types of problems with social and economic rights. So one of the things that we start to see changing is that during the peace process, the discussions of the peace process, the women's movement started to integrate this kind of insights. How to understand the relationship between women and land tenure, and how to translate that into the agreement and then into specific measures to implement the agreement. So today we have a women's movement that is more, I would say, insightful about other dimensions of the woman's experience and other dimensions that need to be accomplished in order to, or just to guarantee that women have all their rights protected. So I guess that's one successful story. Of course, the implementation of the peace process has been difficult, but we are making progress slowly on that.
Thank you for also bringing in a bit of an optimistic note here, Alina. And yeah, before coming to the last question, I just want to say that you can already post questions in the chat, as some of you are already doing, so that Yanis can already collect them. And yeah, so the last question that I have for today is for Millie. And Millie, you emphasize your commitment to engage scholarship. And you've also written on yeah, what you call inconvenient findings for policymakers. And I would like to ask you about your experience in that regard, and also whether something has changed after addressing the issue publicly.
Thanks, Mariam. Yeah, another really thought-provoking and difficult question, and I think one where I feel internally quite conflicted and kind of externally quite conflicted, and conflicted in all the ways. So I think just to kind of contextualize for people in the audience who may not have read that blog post that Marie and I wrote on inconvenient findings, well, I mean, maybe before I get to that, actually, I'll kind of just turn that back around and say, one of the things that I'm constantly reflecting on and I think reconsidering is what our job is as academics, and specifically what my job is as an academic, you know, how I conceive of my own work as an academic, what that means, what it involves, especially since we've all gotten here to some extent, to different degrees, maybe through kind of like I was talking about at the beginning, structures of violence and privilege and inequality. And so how do we reflect on our own positionality and our work in that context when we are kind of especially continuing to benefit from systems of knowledge production for which the benefits are unequally distributed. And I think, like, in some ways, and I know Marie Berry, my co-author, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about this the last couple of years, and I wish she was here to give a more eloquent, I think, summary of some of the directions our conversations have been going in. But I think one of the things that we have come to thinking is that well, first of all, there's a big push for policy relevance in academia, within our institutions, within my institution at LSE, within a lot of US institutions. There's really like a kind of, I think some, what's the word, like a benefit or appreciation for you put it, Miriam, engaged research, which I think is a much better frame to think of than policy relevant necessarily. But I think the reality is that a lot of policy relevant work often means kind of legitimizing, in some ways, quite reformist, incrementalist projects that shore up the same kind of systems of knowledge production that grant legitimacy to certain forms of expertise over others. And by that, I mean, maybe it's helpful to speak about this really concrete example that we wrote about in the blog post, which was that Marie and I were asked to write this report from an organization I won't name, on some of the findings of our research. And it turned out that they really didn't like what we wrote because it made some of the projects that the organization supported look not great, or it shed a kind of critical light in some ways on the projects that the organization was otherwise really invested in. This specifically was with regard to women's political representation. And the report that we wrote was really critiqued on the basis of not being scientific, because we were really drawing from quite like a lot of fairly embedded interview data that wasn't not systematically collected, but it was really reflecting the kind of positions of and perspectives of people who were really the most excluded from systems of power. And I think we kind of pushed back a bit on that to say, well, you know, if these women and communities are not being served by these policies, then that's important knowledge to have. And that's not to say that that there aren't other benefits of some of these programs, but to just kind of write these critiques out is really damaging and dangerous. And I think it kind of led us to question and reflect on the types of findings that are more easily published, more palatable, more digestible, more kind of amenable to policy audiences. And those are findings that can help us reform and make better systems that we already have in place, rather than kind of critique for the sake of critique. And I'm not a fan anyway of critique for the sake of critique, but I think there is a place oftentimes for pointing out where things aren't working, or where things are resulting in unintended consequences. And I think the impetus towards policy relevant research can kind of dampen the radical potential of academic scholarship. And that's not to say academic scholarship is necessarily radical, or it's always radical, or should be radical. But for me as an academic, I think it's not to say I would always resist doing policy relevant work. That's not the case at all. I think most of my work is in some ways kind of engaged or policy relevant, and I engage specifically in kind of reformist projects as well. So it's not to say that I think that's invaluable, but I just think we should be attentive to what gets left out when we are focused on doing that kind of scholarship and that kind of research, and speaking to policy audiences, and resist the urge to kind of privilege that over other potentially more radical projects, findings, etc. And especially when we're embedded in institutions like LSE, that carries a great deal of kind of capital and prestige, it creates an additional, I think, responsibility to maybe use that that position to push agendas that are challenging to status quo rather than status quo reinforcing, and to resist that incentive to kind of strip down or water down or de-radicalize in ways that can be palatable to policymakers who are invested in kind of making systems better that we already have, rather than necessarily being open to thinking more creatively about the ways that the systems that exist are kind of exacting violence and harm. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, Mariam, but
yeah, perfectly, thank you. And I think, I mean, this pushing also like other perspectives, I think that's very important. And I would maybe just add that, I mean, of course, it's also exhausting, right? If you go into these frictional engagements with policymakers, and then it's a choice that we maybe have to make from time to time to actually also seek these frictional engagements, and not only those that are like specifically catered to that audience. And I think, yeah, that's a great point to go over to our questions from the audience. And I have a first question for Lina, and that would be whether you could share the broad contours on how insurgent feminism was constructed and how it challenged radical feminism.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I think there is another one related to the FARC feminism.
You can take both of them together if you like.
Yes.
I mean, the second one would be on like, yeah, learning more about the research with demobilized FARC women and the insurgent feminist approaches that you mentioned, and how these insurgent feminist approaches are influenced by these women's experiences of armed struggle and by transnational Latin American feminist movements, and how they differ from the narrow women's rights focus on transitional justice and humanitarianism. So probably they fit well together, yeah.
Yes, yes. So thank you so much to Rinku and Eva for their questions. So one of the first things that I want to say about that is that I haven't interviewed directly demobilized women, and I decided that because they have been interviewed 1,000 times. And when I started to be interested about this topic, I decided not to expose them to more interviews. I decided just to go through all the interviews that were available. There are a lot of master and doctorate degrees theses that have a lot of verbatims, a lot of newspaper interviews, a lot of different media outlets interviews. So that's one of the things that I wanted to tell you. I said to myself, if after going through all this material, I see that I need to interview them, I'll do them. I'll do it. But right now, so far, I think is not necessary. Maybe later in the process, it would be advisable to do so. But a lot of researchers and a lot of journalists have done that. So that's to say that if you just Google and Google Translate is, and there are interviews in English as well. And so if you Google it or use any browser and you Google FARC women and feminism, I guess you can get something in Spanish or in English. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that this has been very controversial. This has been very controversial because one part of the demobilized women allege, and there are testimonies about that, and also research and legal processes, that within the FARC a lot of human rights violations occurred against women. For instance, sexual violence of different types, one of the issues in FARC was forced contraception. And so there is a movement also against any feminist embellishment of what happened during their life in the guerrillas. So in the guerrilla group. So it is important to say that not all the women are part of this movement of converting their armed struggle into a feminist endeavor in their civilian life. And so there is a corporation, an NGO that is called Rosa Blanca, White Rose, that what they do is just to make visible the testimonies of women that suffer really serious human rights violations in the FARC guerrilla. Okay, so talking about what they have done, this woman, especially this woman that were very visible in the guerrilla when they demobilized. This woman, the FARC was a very particular guerrilla in the sense that around the 1980s they decided to turn, basically to shift from a guerrilla to something similar to an army of the people. They call themselves the army of the people. And to do so, they decided just to really isolate themselves from the civilians, the civilians population. And one of the strategies they did to do so was to create a really complete life within the group. And to do so, they had to recruit women in order to have women in their ranks to have a complete life. That means having an emotional life within the guerrillas, etc. So FARC is a guerrilla that had a substantial amount of women in their ranks starting in the 1980s, date of the 1970s. So when they demobilized, there were a lot of women being part of this group, and some of them had attained really prominent positions, although they were not part of the highest echelons of the guerrilla group. But when they went to Havana and they saw that the women's movement, the Colombian women's movement, was asking for more protagonism in the talks, this woman also started to pressure their I don't remember the names exactly, but they call it, the highest echelon was called like the secretariat. They started to pressure the secretariat to have a more active role. And what they say is that they started to study feminism. They decided, they started to face a lot of pretty active women in the Havana coming from the Colombian civil society. So they started just to try to shape their discourse around that. So when they demobilized, they decided in the Congress that the guerrilla, they call it the conferences. The guerrilla usually had conferences. I don't remember if they were like every 5 years, or they were periodical conferences. So when they had the conference before signing the peace agreement with the Colombian government, they decided to include feminist insights in that conference, and they decided to write like a manifesto. They are called the feminist thesis of the Farianas, FARC, the woman of the FARC, and they write a manifesto. And this manifesto is really crucial for the next steps in the mobilization. What is different between, or how different is this insurgent feminism? They call it, one of these demobilized women said something like this, like in the past we hold the arms to make changes, now we are feminist to make those changes. And so they call it, and so we are insurgent feminists. Their feminism is different in the sense that it has a socialist strand, it has a socialist inspiration. They place their emphasis, they emphasize on capitalism, on the negative side of capitalism. they openly try to integrate men in their movement. They say men are essential to our movement. They vindicate their life as members of a guerrilla group. They vindicate that they use arms. They vindicate that that was needed in that specific moment of the Colombian history. And at the same time, they say this is the moment just to lead this struggle in a different way through political and pacific means. So yeah, so basically their inspiration is more socialist. They place more emphasis on capitalism, on the sexual division of work, and of course they talk about sexual violence, but that's a consequence of their approach to the discrimination of women and discrimination of, and they embrace also, this is, I think it's interesting, they embrace sexual orientation and gender diversity from the beginning, something that didn't happen for the women's movement. The women's movement embrace soji later. They embrace basically soji, I guess, like the 10 or 15 years ago, but at the beginning they were separate. Like the soji movement was on this side and the women's movement was on this side, and it wasn't easy, their dialogue between them. But the Farianas, the FARC, the women of the FARC feminism embraced from the beginning the LGBT agenda. So yeah, I guess this is a very simple version of of their proposal, their feminist proposal. But I wrote an article about that in English for the Cornell Journal of International Law in 2019, and another article is coming soon about that.
Yeah, thank you, Lina. I think that was already quite comprehensive and giving us a like huge insight into these differences. I think Yanis has a question now.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to the three of you. I think this was like so inspiring, and this is so much food for thought that I'll just concentrate on two things that I was interested in based on what my own research touches upon. So the one is that throughout the last, I would say, decade or 2 decades or so, and I mean, especially in peace building and post-conflict interventions by international organizations, there has been this turn towards, the local communities, the local level, this incorporation of the family as a site or a breeding ground for peace building bottom up, basically, that IOs can, in a way, capitalize on and get on board with, and then, through funding and other structures, support in a process of kind of scaling up peace from bottom up, in a complementary process to top-down peace building processes. So this has been criticized a lot, and then at the same time, what I've found is that recent research on peace building that has taken on a more gendered perspective on these bottom-up processes in concepts of everyday peace and others have found that indeed it is like practices of care and silence that are often sustained by women, through which women sustain actually peace and minimize violence in families and also the wider communities and so on. But at the same time, these practices, they also, in a way enshrine or condition their own insecurity and their own gendered insecurity. So in a way, the logic that actually propels that may actually forward the big, larger piece is the one that imperils actually the agents, if you will, right? So I was wondering in how far you have encountered, because many of the authors that have actually proposed these or have done this research on, they actually have a very feminist agenda in mind, or at least they claim to do so. And I was wondering in how far you have encountered, and I guess this is a question to probably the three of you, but maybe I had more Millie in mind since it is more it's concrete on the intervention. In how far you have encountered instances where you have these findings that where you can read something into them that would actually forward an agenda that you try to criticize. I'm not sure if it's clear what I mean, but
I think so. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite hear you just at the very beginning because my connection seemed to be, no, it wasn't. I think it was me because I had to switch location briefly. And so so is your question, we see a conflict between sometimes the kind of possibilities for transformative change and the micro level findings that curtail that, or did I flip that the wrong way around? Maybe you could.
No, I guess my question is about the conflict in dealing with processes that on the one hand may lead to an abatement of violence on a macro level, but at the same time enshrine disenfranchisement and potentially also marginalization and violation of gendered rights on a micro level, actually, where these two things are in tension, right? Which is something different yeah. So basically, where these two types of peace, let's say on a micro and macro level, to just put it very bluntly, are in inherent tension to each other.
It's such an important question, and I think one that, I mean, I'd love to hear specific examples that you have in mind, but I think it's one we see often in our work with regard to backlash violence. And I saw there's also a kind of question not about backlash necessarily, but about like anti-feminist agendas. So I think, I mean, there are two ways I interpret that question, and one is, in fact, I'm just going to make a note to make sure I remember. Okay, so the first is that I think we see oftentimes in pushes for radical transformative change, feminist agendas, etc., there is a lot of violence that can result in the immediate term from those efforts, for which the women who are most at the margins, or communities who are most at the margins, not necessarily only women, pay the highest price for. So just, I mean, this is something that comes up in our work all the time, but that if we think about women's political participation, for example, that elite women from certain political backgrounds, women who are associated with particular armed groups or bound up with certain business interests, etc., are able to kind of access reins of power fairly easily, while women who are kind of living at the margins are subject to much, disproportionate violence, punishment, and backlash as a result of doing so. I'm not sure if that's kind of exactly what you were getting at, because I think that it's certainly an instance where we see more, the push to kind of more gender equal societies in public space, for example, resulting in inequalities and violence and kind of exacerbated forms of harm in women's lives. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing that your comment makes me think of is work that I've done, not with the Women's Rights After War project, but with other related projects. I had a project in Congo and Central African Republic a few years ago that was looking at actually like women's economic empowerment and thinking about power in the household, in familial relationships, in society, etc., and different perspectives and attitudes towards claiming power that different women held. And obviously we have, this is kind of goes back a bit to some themes Lewis was touching on earlier, but like this conflict or tension between what different communities, differently situated communities, actually want and feel is meaningful to them in their own lives. And I think in that project we saw again and again, actually, like there was a masculinities project I was working on in Congo, and the women we were interviewing were the wives of the husbands that the project was targeting, were the most resistant, I think, to the changes in the household, the kind of positive masculinity frame that the project was pushing. And a lot of the men who were participating in the program, not all of them, but like really kind of, and you know, had some very interesting and open and kind of engaged reflections and reactions to ideas about gender equality that many of the women that we were interviewing really resisted. So I think we see multiple different forms of tension. I think one of the things I would maybe be a bit resistant to is the idea that that macro level changes that don't that don't resonate with people's micro kind of everyday experiences are rarely the kind of radicalizing or transformative visions that they are intended to be. And that I think one of the things that I would like quite strongly hold on to is the idea that people know that, you know, kind of know their own lives and their own realities and their own situations and have more expertise over that than anybody else can ever have. And so that doesn't always look like what we might expect, but ways of kind of advancing transformative change has to center how people kind of imagine their own power in those like micro everyday moments. And even when that often does sit in tension to what might look like more radical or transformative potential over the long term, that was like really incoherent. And I'm not sure if I really answered what you were asking, but I'm wondering if you have like examples in your mind from your own work or experience.
Was that addressed to Yannis?
Yannis, yeah, I was just curious. I mean, if we have time, and no worries if not.
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe since there's a couple of more people who have asked a couple of questions. I mean, you definitely answered a lot of what I had in mind. I was just interested in your viewpoint on that. But yeah, maybe I will think of rephrasing that in a more precise way and get back to you in a way that it might, you know, make more sense than how I phrased it. But
No, it made sense. It's like a messy, complicated question. So I think my answer was also messy and complicated. But...
So Mariam, I think we have one more question from the chat.
Yeah, and I think Luis can perfectly take that question. Since he already hinted at some of the issues, and the question would be that on the one hand, feminist agendas, feminist approaches are on the rise, but on the other hand, anti-gender, anti-feminist agendas are also on the rise. And whether you've encountered these opposing dynamics in your research. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for that question, Lara. And yes, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, perhaps less so around kind of peace building, which isn't really the frame that's used in the context I work in, but I think, but certainly the kind of growth in recognition of the need to, the growing recognition of the need to recognize the ways that women are differently situated and the particular needs they have and the ways they're affected by conflict and its aftermath. That I think that is in many ways growing. I think if you look, I mean, depends on how far back you look, right? But if you know, going back in my research to some of the literatures that were written, I was going to say 30, but honestly, I think even 15 or 20 years ago, for example, the work that Erin Baines did on vulnerability in and the ways that women were positioned within UNHCR's work feels like something really quite noticeable has shifted over that time period in terms of the fact that, you know, gender is a talking point and is part of the structures in a way that it certainly didn't used to be. And I think so. And then the Laura's question speaks to the kind of anti-gender, anti-feminist agendas that are also getting more influential. And I think that's exactly one of the reasons why I often found myself stuck, as I said towards the beginning, between these different kinds of feminist agendas, because I think in some ways, understandably, some of the feminists within humanitarianism and all the people working on gender within humanitarianism feel quite strongly that they, I suppose, have to defend at all costs the gains that they have won within humanitarian structures, and feel very strongly that they have carved out a small space for action on these issues, and that I think in that context, it can be, people find it challenging for someone to come and talk about men. However feminist the perspective from which one is coming, I think talking about men then gets placed into this kind of opposing camp. And of course, part of the problem is that some of the people who want to talk about men are doing exactly that. And some of the people who want to talk about men are coming from an anti-feminist agenda and think that there is far too much focus on women in war and conflict and refugeehood. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think I'm very much felt like I'm confronted by those opposing dynamics, and it going back to the kind of policy engagement, relevance, whatever question, and particularly when one is encouraged when trying to write things for policy audiences to be very brief and to perhaps in a way that feels like you have to remove a lot of the nuance, or you have to come across with one clear point, or all these ways that academics are encouraged to write for policy audiences. It feels very hard to navigate those spaces with honesty and integrity, and in ways in which you'll be able to communicate what you want to communicate, given that broader debate that's going on. And I think also one of the things that, this isn't particularly something I research, but I know colleagues who I think are, like, I think one of the things that we also increasingly have to take into account, and are going to have to take into account, the increasing prominence. Yes, I think increasing prominence probably is fair, at least in many contexts, at least in many sort of contexts in the global North minority world, of trans-exclusionary feminist discourses and policies and practices. And I'll always remember, this was a fellow researcher who told me this. We have some shared research interests, and told me of a time when one of her humanitarian interviewees, who was a gender specialist, described the LGBTI agenda as a distraction from the women and girls agenda, which of course, begs a lot of questions about which women and what do you imagine about these women's lives, and so on and so forth. And I suppose my fear is that the transnational anti-gender, anti-feminist agendas are going to coexist with and/or overlap with the rising anti-trans, trans-exclusionary discourses too. And I think that will add to the challenges of doing this kind of work and making feminist progress within those sectors.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for the reminder to for like all of you to basically embrace complexity and also show it, I think. And we have one anonymous question, and I just got it, so I'm going to read it out. Thank you for organizing this inspiring discussion. My remark is not meant as a critique, but I wonder, though, if these debates are addressing the right audience. How can we, that is, those who are already convinced of the value of feminist framework of analysis, reach beyond our, in quotation marks, bubble, and actually inject some of our findings into more mainstream debates? The latter seem to be shifting back to Cold War hard politics rather than progressing. And I think since we are approaching the top of the hour, I think this is a great question to close the discussion. And I would give each of you the word, but maybe, very quickly say something about this very complex question. Yeah, Lina, do you want to start?
That's a hard question, really, really hard. I guess I'm just going to say that that's food for thought. I guess a lot of the times I think about the advantages and disadvantages of using this particular kind of framework, and how to, as you said, progress with this, or just to take a step forward and reshape what we already know or what we are convinced about. I guess these spaces are the spaces that we need in order to think about this kind of questions. And it would be great just to have another gathering like this to talk about that specific issue.
Thanks. That was very concise. Millie.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might just thank you for the question, and I might just kind of reiterate what I said before in response to the policy audience question. I actually think there's a lot of push to talk to mainstream audiences already, and that can serve quite de-radicalizing or serve to de-radicalize in ways that are not always as helpful as we would hope. So I mean, I guess that's the difference between a question of whether we are targeting the right audiences or who is hearing us. And I actually think there's a value to not trying to kind of make palatable the conversations or be too inclusive. But I change my mind on this every single day. So I really, yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question, except that right now, today at 4:58 in London time, I say no, but I might say something different tomorrow.
Thank you. And yeah, I think it's a good reminder that we can also learn and change our minds from time to time. Luis, last word.
Yeah. When you read out that question, I was thinking, oh, I hope Miriam doesn't come to me first. Just what do I say to that? And still, a few minutes later, I'm not much better off. I mean, I think it's a very important question and sort of productive challenge. I mean, I think I would maybe reiterate some of what Millie just said. And so, because of the way my research sits relative to different disciplines, I sometimes wear a kind of refugees and migration hat, if you like, in an academic disciplinary sense. And I do generally find it very frustrating that migration researchers are, the emphasis on migration researchers having policy impact, as if what was needed was more evidence of what good migration policies would be. The fundamental problem is that policymakers, for a whole range of reasons, do not listen to and or implement and or can't implement due to political pressures those policies. So that isn't in any case or sense meant to dismiss the importance of change or the importance that policies have in people's everyday lives. But I also think we should be realistic about what we could even plausibly achieve. And I think sometimes the imperatives to have more impact in a range of different settings is perhaps not very realistic about the kind of political and structural pressures to which we are also subject. So I think, as Lena said, it's definitely something to talk about more. I suppose the one thing I would say, which is an answer to that question, is in a sense, the one thing that we definitely can do is to always try to embody these principles in our daily practices and lives. And I think a lot of feminist researchers are often frustrated, absolutely correctly, by the sort of how radical research is not always translated into the daily lives of the people who are writing that research. And so I think always striving to be the same people in our daily lives as we are in our research and writing is at least one thing we can do. Not that that is about to have a transformational policy impact, but it is nonetheless something that is within our control.